Okay, hello again, and welcome back to now week 9 of insect ecology. And so what we're going to do in this week's materials a little bit is start moving from what we've been thinking about in really the past few weeks of how species interact directly, whether or not that's between plants and insects, between herbivores, competition, these different kinds of interactions, and zooming out a little bit and thinking about how those interactions either are a product of or can also drive patterns of evolution. So in some ways, moving a little bit from the ecological scale to the evolutionary scale and thinking about the relationship between sort of short-term, we might call ecological dynamics, and the long-term geological scale, sometimes evolutionary dynamics. And so just to kick us off on that, I want to define really a couple terms that'll help set the stage for what you're going to hear about a little bit more in this week's lesson plan, thinking about coevolution first between an antagonistic relationship, revisiting sort of plant-insect interactions and thinking about how those evolve, and then thinking after that about these mutualistic relationships, focusing in particular on the mutualistic relationship between plants and pollinators. So one sort of broad term I want to define is actually coevolution itself. So what does that mean when we say, we might have some intuition about what it means to co-evolve, but really what we mean is very generally when two species reciprocally affect each other's evolution. So this is a little bit vague and can mean a lot of different things, but you can think about, for example, if you think about a pollinator here, this is a swallowtail feeding on a flowering plant, the traits of both of these species, right? So the capacity to fly, the shape of the proboscis to actually gather food resources of the pollinator, are linked to the traits and the phenotype of the flowering plant here. So the shape and color, the quality of nectar being provided, the traits of these two groups, two species, but also broader groups of flowering plants and pollinators are really affecting each other, right? So there's what we might call reciprocal adaptation, also called co-adaptation, that you have not just a little bit different than, for example, an adaptation, say, to a thermal environment where you might have adaptation directly to an environment. This is the sort of matching of adaptations between species. So coevolution, again, we can kind of think of as reciprocal adaptation or co-adaptation. And this is a little bit different than this related phenomenon of co-speciation. And this is not just, so for example, coevolution can happen in just a couple species, right? It doesn't really say anything in particular about how those species diversify over time or change sort of at the phylogenetic scale. So one useful definition here to think about is actually co-speciation itself, and this is where interacting groups over evolutionary time will speciate in tandem. So if we think about, for example, a host, and this is an example from lice, but if you imagine a tight coupling between, and this is sort of true of our gut microbiome potentially, right? As say the host species diversifies, right? So this is a phylogeny, right, of showing the evolutionary relationships between on one side the host, on the other side the lice here. As one of those groups diversifies or speciates, you expect sort of parallel speciation in the other group that it is interacting with. So what that ends up in is a pattern that we call congruent phylogenies. So the sort of shape of the evolutionary history of one group will actually parallel the shape of the evolutionary history of the other group. So essentially, paired phylogenetic histories. And this is a nice way to sort of schematically diagram it, but when we look at these patterns in real data, rarely is it so tight and clean as this. There's often not sort of perfect congruence between phylogenies. This is an example from figs and fig wasps that you'll hear a little bit more about in the videos later on this week. But again, we can, even if not sort of this perfect textbook or schematic example, we often do see these congruent phylogenetic and evolutionary patterns, even with some complexity on top of them. And this idea of co-speciation or congruent phylogenies is related to a third term, co-diversification. This is really parallel diversification, often at the same time between groups. So co-speciation is basically, again, this idea whether or not the phylogenies match. Co-diversification, which is again related but maybe broader term, is when two interacting groups, say two phylogenies, are diversifying at the same time because of their interaction. So an example of this might be flowering plants and pollinators, or beetles. We're going to read some, or talk through and read some examples of these kinds of often rapid, these amazing evolutionary radiations that seem to happen between groups at the same time. So this is co-diversification. So again, all that is really just to give you a little bit of an introduction to some of the basic concepts of, again, moving from these ecological interactions to over evolutionary time, how these patterns might evolve. And what we're going to walk through in the rest of the lesson today is think in a little more detail about how some of these patterns work, first in the coevolution of an antagonistic relationship between plants and herbivorous insects, which we've already learned a little bit about the basics of those interactions, and so now we're going to move into maybe how they've evolved and some of the evolutionary arms races that could be driving them. And in the second half, we'll shift a little bit to thinking about how coevolution might play out in mutualistic relationships, thinking in particular about plants and pollinators.